Since 1945, the world has seen a lot of conflicts and issues that have cropped up that had never occurred before in world history, such as genocide, ethnic tensions, countries dividing into two. And if you're wondering where lots of these problems, everything from HIV/AIDS all the way to the Zika virus to the development, or rather the change of the United States policies towards Cuba in the past couple of months, all of these have a source. So let's talk about 7 problems that have confronted the world since 1945. So roughly, we're going to be speaking about these 7 problems that are going to be coming up here in just a second from 1945 to 1990, because there's a couple things that we could definitely leave out, such as the mass migration of human beings out of, for example, currently the Middle East to Europe, but then also the migration of people from Latin America up to North America. Or, for example, ISIS and terrorism. Those things are going to be left for a later lecture. Here, we're just going to be focusing on things from 1945 to 1990. During this time, nations had a lot going on, and one of these questions that they had to deal with was, what is the best way to deal with the problems of modernity? What are we going to do when we have to start industrializing? How are we going to progress? Also, countries after World War II were left with big legacies from colonialism and how colonialism affected their societies. Answering these questions, as you guys are going to see, is really, really difficult, and countries have a variety of solutions and tactics that they approached, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. Problem number 1 that cropped up after 1945 was the rise of dictators, or so-called strongmen. Now, that is not a gender-biased term, because generally speaking, these people were men, and they also were strong, not necessarily physically, but definitely in their power. And after 1945, these kind of people come in a huge variety and different styles. We have some that are left-leaning populists, we have others that are military dictators that are more right-wing, and then we also have the rise of some leaders through religious fundamentalist movements, especially around the time of the 1970s and 1980s. As an example of this, it can be seen through the left wing, the rise of certain Marxist revolutionaries such as Fidel Castro and Che in Cuba. Where Fidel establishes, and as it is still today, a Marxist/totalitarian rule that kind of gets befuddled there in absolute power. On the other hand, you have military coups that start to take over in certain parts of the world. And in Egypt, you have, for example, General Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose successor, Hosni Mubarak, was just actually deposed about 3 or 4 years ago. And since then, there was a brief intermittent rule by another religious group called the Muslim Brotherhood, but then there was once again another military coup in Egypt that is currently in charge of that country. But also, as an example of the religious fundamentalist movements, you have people such as Ayatollah Khomeini, who led the revolution in Iran in 1979 against a US-backed Shah, which of course the US wasn't too happy about. All right, but we have the rise of these, as you can see, all men who were very, very heavy-handed in terms of governing. Problem number 2, when these leaders get in charge, or when other democratic leaders get in charge elsewhere in the world during the Cold War, many of these leaders promise that things are going to change from the past, which generally speaking for most of them was being colonized. But there's a question: if you are or have been colonized, how are you going to develop, and what method are you going to do it through? Are you going to take capitalism with the United States, or models of socialism or Marxism through the Soviet Union? Or are you going to try to do a mix of either? And these kind of questions are really, really hard for countries to decide what to do with. Regardless though, many of these developing countries, often called the Third World because they weren't really owned by the United States or the Soviet Union, have to deal with greater industrialization after World War II. And if we remember our earlier mini lesson on industrialization in the world, industrialization comes along with a lot of problems like population growth, social classes, disease, exploitation of labor such as children or women, and these problems get insanely magnified after World War II in places like Latin America and Asia and Africa. Industrialization causes really, really strong political, social, and economic disruption in these countries. As an example, here is a graph of life expectancy at birth in Africa, okay, all the way going from 1960 to 2010, and you can see that about 1990, the AIDS epidemic hits Africa full blown. And as a model of industrialization, you have people living close together, also, not only having sexual contact with one another, but also living in that close proximity that helps spread disease. Even though Africa will, and as you see on the graph, will recover population-wise, that kind of economic damage that comes as a result of industrialization, like disease, really can hurt a country. If you imagine, as a counterexample, if those people would not have died, think about what the current population of Africa would be and how much economic power it would have as well. It'd be much different than what, today's world would be. Problem number 4. So no matter if industrialization happens or not, the question is, what model are you going to use to develop? Are you going to use one by the United States or one by the Soviet Union? Now, there are countries who are going to kind of split the divide between these two, but really countries were left with these two kind of models after World War II, and that is liberal capitalism, which is promoted by the US, which has some elements of socialism, especially after, FDR and the New Deal and things like that, but it is still it is a market-driven economy. On the other hand, you have a type of rule that's based on totalitarian communism, where it's a state-directed kind of socialism. But both systems profoundly affect local people and how they are going to live in their everyday worlds. Many people found themselves between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, liberal capitalism promises development. It's an idea that we're going to invest in your country and people are going to get better. But if you think about like a Walmart moving into a local, competing against a local farmer's market, Walmart or other big corporations will oftentimes run roughshod over them. And that's because capitalism is so efficient sometimes that it does tend to hurt people's livelihoods. And this disruption as well, when certain people start to benefit from industrialization more than other people, or some people benefit from capitalism more than other people, this can often cause really big issues between social classes. On the other hand, totalitarian socialism really isn't as efficient as pure capitalism. It doesn't take into account certain things like human motivation. This can help explain, but not totally explain, why certain things like the Great Leap Forward or things like that can result in things like mass starvation or the providing of really bad services. It's just not as efficient as pure capitalism. Another bad thing, though, about choosing totalitarian socialism is that it usually means you end up on the wrong side of US policy, and generally you're not looked very well upon by the United States, which in the Cold War, and especially after the Cold War, isn't too nice of a thing. Problem number 5 is Neo-Colonialism. Neo-colonialism, the simple definition of it is that it is colonialism after World War II. And this comes in a huge variety of forms. Some are a little bit more obvious and some aren't as obvious. One of the ones from the West that many people have criticized, maybe unduly but maybe fairly, depending on your point of view, is the IMF, which stands for the International Monetary Fund. What the IMF does is it provides loans to developing countries, but those loans often come with what are called stipulations, or basically reforms that those countries have to do. Oftentimes this is cutting things like social services or state subsidies of certain industries such as like coal or heating or gas. When these reforms happen, many people who are often depending on those things are hurt by those reforms. However, many countries need those developing loans to help them, improve their economies or increase capital to build factories. Another example of neo-colonialism would be banana republics that are set up after World War II in places like Latin America, especially by the United Fruit Company. If you're familiar with Dole, or if you ever eaten a banana from Honduras or Guatemala, you have eaten a banana that's probably come from at least what was at one time a banana republic. For the Soviet Union, neo-colonialism was a little bit more direct, not usually through companies, but normally through influence through war and other things. This would be things like, for example, the Korean and Vietnam War, where they provide funding to those particular countries to resist US influence there. Problem number 6, women's rights. Women have had it really rough in terms of equal rights in terms of world history. It's been really tough for ladies. and women do begin to earn some rights after World War II in a limited capacity. If women do enjoy success, such as Indira Gandhi that you can see right over here, it's oftentimes because of their relationship with men. For example, Indira, or Miss Gandhi that you can see here, not related to the Gandhi in any way, she was the daughter of India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, and she really became famous through him, besides, totally looking like them. Women have struggled to earn, at least even here in the United States, equal pay compared to men. This has been a continuing problem in world history and probably will continue to be one for a long time. Problem number 7. Devolution movements. Devolution is not the opposite of evolution, but what it is a splitting, a devolving of things that were before. So if you remember back to colonialization, such as Africa, European powers often drew boundaries across ethnic, linguistic, cultural groups to create these artificial borders that they used to create countries. But after they become independent, the thing that was really only holding those countries together oftentimes were those particular colonial powers. And when those colonial powers leave, many of these groups want their own nations, and that's called devolution. So this results in nations like today, actually one that's happened here recently in the past 10 years, such as South and North Sudan, which have split over religious difference with Christians in the South and Muslims in the North, famously across the 10th parallel. And if you look at a map here of just the linguistic family groups in Africa compared to the actual country borders in Africa, none of the linguistic borders really match up with the country borders over here. And that's because things like straight lines that you can see on the map were often drawn by European powers even as far back as 1885 during the Berlin Conference. So again, these have been 7 problems that have confronted the modern world from 1945 to 1990. Of course, there's probably many ones that many problems that have confronted the world since then that I miss. So please feel free to add a comment or some other insight that you feel has also been an issue in world history during this time that I left unaddressed. Until that time, I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye!